And another book that is less well known that I discovered in Tilburg, not in the US, believe it or not, in the university bookstore, and it's called Philosophy, Politics, and Economics. And it's a wonderful book. It was published in 2008, and I plan, in fact, to use it in my course. Today, Professor Gaus will talk about the egalitarian species. And this is part of a series of lectures called the Freedom Lectures that are connected to our Templeton program on personal freedom. So we have in PP a huge Templeton grant and program on personal freedom. And indeed, if you are ever interested, we have a site, www.pfrb.personalfreedomresearchproject.com. So you can go there and see the kind of things we do. So without much ado, please.
Thank you, Christine. So I prepared a talk for a very intimate setting, very informal, just like this. So we'll see to the extent this intimate talk can be transferred to this dramatic classroom. So thanks, of course, thank you all for coming today because the weather is so lovely. It's wonderful to be here. Actually, I live in Tucson, and my wife says, "Are you really going to that horrible place we call the Northeast?" Like, it's 75, it's sunny, and it's been 75 and sunny for the last month. And I said, "Well, I'm going to go to Philadelphia." She thinks you're out of your mind. But only for all my wonderful friends here that could make a trip to such an unpleasant place worthwhile. So my problem today that I want to talk about is a problem in evolutionary theory, or the evolution of morality. And I'm going to call it Hayek's worry. And I think Hayek's worry is a fundamentally important worry. It's a worry that perhaps two mechanisms of evolution clash in the development of morality. But before talking about the particular problem, I want to say why I want to talk about F.A. Hayek. Known mostly as an economist, mostly as a libertarian-ish economist. So I first want to talk about Hayek, because I think Hayek is a tremendously underappreciated figure. So in the last 15 years, there's been tremendous gains made in trying to model how important aspects of our morality could come about. Important modeling, for example, of how altruism could come about. One of the things about altruists is that they seem to take costs into their own fitness in order to increase the fitness of others, and a fundamental evolutionary question is how could something which seems fitness decreasing evolve? And there's been lots of stories about it, but the last 10 or 15 years, really important models have made more sense of that using multi-level selection. Important evidence about the development of normative guidance, all sorts of things that were deep puzzles maybe 20 years ago are becoming less deep puzzles. I mean, we certainly don't know it all, but we've understood a lot about how morality evolves. Philosophers have taken up on this and have considered evolutionary views of morality. And I want to talk about them a bit. But there's a glaring problem in almost every main philosopher's view about the evolution of morality, is that only concerned with biological evolution, genetic evolution. Sometimes people still draw on E.L. Wilson in sociobiology from 30 years ago. Lately, Philip Kitcher, an important philosopher of biology, has written a book, The Ethical Project, which he tries to show that out of evolutionary process, we can develop a view of morality, and yet the book is almost entirely about biological evolution, about the evolution essentially up to maybe 40,000 years ago, something like that. Kitcher has a chapter on what we call social evolution, the evolution of norms, the evolution of rules, but he really doesn't clearly know what to do with it. For most philosophers, evolution means genetic, Darwinian, biological evolution. Therefore, an evolutionary account of morality is an account of Darwinian biological evolution. That's sort of really surprising, given that so much of the interesting work on the theory side is in the complicated interplay between cultural and genetic evolution. Most importantly and famously, the work of Boyd and Richardson have shown that it's going to be really interesting, complicated interplays between biological evolution and genetic evolution. One of the most interesting is lactose intolerance. Lactose intolerance only developed, lactose tolerance developed about 8,000 to 10,000 years ago. As you know, a lot of people can drink milk and digest it, many people can't. Well, it turns out that if you look at the sources of lactose tolerance, they're strongly correlated with peoples who kept herds of mammals. And what it looks like is that we're generally not lactose tolerant, but as culture developed, and some cultures, especially in Northern Europe, began keeping mammals, it was then advantageous in that culture to be able to drink mammalian milk, and lactose tolerance then developed really pretty late, probably as a response to this culture of keeping animals. And you can look at maps of keeping herds and maps of lactose tolerance, and you see they're extraordinarily closely related. So the theories are beginning to look very seriously at the way culture and genetics play with each other, interact. And yet, philosophers have not considered in any systematic way the fact that perhaps what we mean by the evolution of morality is not just biological, but also cultural evolution. In fact, sometimes if a person talks about cultural evolution, a philosopher will say they're not really an evolutionary theorist. And one of the things that's really, I think, remarkable is that Hayek was worried about this problem from the 50s on. One of the tragedies of Hayek, this is sort of a tragedy of a lot of philosophy, is that our philosophy curriculum is divided into these niches. There's a niche that needs to be filled, libertarian or classical liberal. Hayek is used for that niche. It's not a very important niche, but it's one that's necessary to fill, and so Hayek is pushed there. But in fact, Hayek's work in the 50s and 60s and into the 70s was really some cutting-edge work. First of all, on complexity theory and on social evolution. He ran a seminar at the University of Chicago, interdisciplinary seminar on evolutionary theory right through the 50s. And geneticists and biologists and social scientists met to talk about the nature of evolution. I think, are you all okay with this? No? Okay, so let's interrupt it. Okay? Okay. So, we're at Chicago in the 50s. One of the people who came to Hayek's seminar was a very famous biologist, C.O. Wright, and he was developing group selectionist theories at the time. Now, what's really cool is that many of these ideas that Hayek was developing in the 50s and the 60s were just dismissed in the 50s and 60s as sort of neo-fascist ideology. The social evolutionary thought was really strong in the first parts of the century, last part of the 19th century, but after the Second World War and Nazism, people were afraid to even talk about social evolution. To talk about it was to see it as a sort of Nazism. Group selection, which Hayek emphasized, was seen as an obvious error, certainly by the 70s, and again, it was seen as having fascist overtones. So Hayek was doing a lot of really fundamental work that in many ways is more sophisticated than philosophers are doing now, because he's thinking about morality as a system which has evolved biologically and which has also evolved socially. So the prolegomena is why I consider Hayek as not just a libertarian. It's because he was developing theory of complex phenomena and theories of coevolution well into the 50s, and in many ways, from the 50s on, and in many ways it's more sophisticated than anything philosophers have to offer today. That's why I want to talk about Hayek's worry rather than someone else's worry. So I've been talking a lot about evolution and morality and what we mean, a view of philosophy that sees morality as evolving. I'm not going to say a lot exactly what that means, but I'm going to try to at least give you some ideas what it doesn't mean and point you in a very general direction of what I think my subject is. If you look at one on your handout, this is a quote from Darwin. It says, Darwin, if man were reared under precisely the same conditions as a hive bee, there could hardly be any doubt that our unmarried females would, like the worker bees, think it their sacred duty to kill their brothers, and their mothers would strive to kill their fertile daughters, and no one would think of interfering. This isn't a dissent of me. The fundamental point of this sort of Darwinian view is that morality, as we know it, is an evolved mechanism for creatures like us to live together with our particular proclivities. And humans are a really very unusual and interesting species. We're the only primate eusocial species. Eusocial meaning truly social and deeply social, that our entire life is spent in society. Divisions of labor are very minute. There's only about 3 species. There's 3 main groups of animals that have eusociality. One is the social insects. Ants and the wasps, for example, the bees. They have probably as deeply social lives as we do. But they're seeking, this is disputed among biologists, a very different mechanism for how this sociality came about. One thing, they're closely genetically related. Sometimes up to 2/3 of their genes are shared among sisters in some of these species. In the mammals, there's only 2 eusocial mammal species. One is the African mole rat, which are also closely related, it looks like. And the other one is this really odd primate. It's a sort of aggressive primate. It's concerned about dominance. It's concerned about submission. And yet it manages to live together in extraordinarily complex societies. We call that humans. And what this view is that these humans have managed to pull off what looks like perhaps an incredible thing. Really, basically pretty nasty primates that live together like they're ants. And on this Darwinian view, morality is one of the core things that help us do that. So if we want to know what morality is, we don't look to the skies. What we look to is the social problems that a species like us had interacting together. How did we achieve a cooperative life? That's the basic, most basic thought of what I mean by evolutionary counter-morality. Let me contrast it to 2 other accounts. First is the great 19th, is the 2 on the handout. The great 19th century philosopher Henry Sidgwick replies to Darwin explicitly. And as a good philosopher, he says, no doubt a superior bee, we may be sure, would aspire to a more modern solution to the population problem that Darwin had in mind. I mean, certainly a superior bee, a good utilitarian bee, would figure out a better way to do this. Morality is not something which evolves out of our particular problems and efficient ways to handle them. There's a right way of doing something. And for many philosophers, importantly today, the fact that our species might never be able to do what morality requires in no way impairs the idea that morality requires it. That's just, as one of my friends says, that just goes to show we're not up for morality, but it can't possibly make us question morality. Perhaps morality tells us to do all things that are pretty much outside the bounds of human behavior. So that just goes to show that humans aren't very good, because morality is morality. That's one of the reasons I want to contrast this Darwinian view to. We don't want to say morality is right, although humans couldn't use it. In fact, I think this is a fairly dangerous view, because it might seem like a silly view. But in fact, philosophers have invented what I call bee moralities all the time. The morality would work really well if only we were bees. If only we would do what we're told, if only we cared about others more than ourselves, we would have a perfect system. Plato, I think, invented a bee morality. Contemporary philosophers invent bee moralities. That is, moralities which are not only unfit for us, but should we introduce them would be a disaster for us. The second view that I want to contrast it to is Ken Bidmore, at least the view that Ken suggests in this particular passage. Ken says at 3 on the handout, orthodox moral philosophy has gotten us nowhere because it asks the wrong questions. If morality evolved along with the human race, asking how we ought to live makes as much sense as asking what animals ought to exist or what language you ought to speak. This can be read, I don't think Ken probably means to read it that way, as a real sort of evolutionary quietism. Whatever is evolved is good, we can't even question it. The evolutionary view doesn't require that. It doesn't require that we don't step back, or can't step back, and say, is this a good way for us to live? But it does say that there's real constraints on the answers we can give. What I would suggest If you look at the normative view that I want to think about, the view of morality is I'm going to hand out two desiderata for morality. And these two desiderata are going to be important for the rest of the talk. One is the functional desiderata. And that is that morality has a functional role in life. It does something for us. It's a tool. It's technology. It's not something that we discovered speaking to us. It's a tool we developed so primates like us can live together. Unless a morality serves as an efficient technology of moral cooperation, it's unsuited for us. It would be a bad morality. We want to see if we can satisfy what I call the functional desiderata, that this morality is an efficient tool of social cooperation. The other one I call the moral sentiments desiderata. And that desiderata said, and this maybe we're allowing some understanding of possible evaluation, but whatever this technology is, it has to appeal to our moral sentiments. When we think about a decent way to live together, this technology has to be one that we can see as fair play, empathy, sort of Smithian moral sentiments. It has to make sense of these things. If it doesn't make sense of these things, even if it's functional, it's going to seem unsavory. It's going to seem as something which it might work, but it can't possibly be about morality. I want to look at these two desiderata today and tell a story about how Hayek thinks these desiderata may come apart and the problems for these coming apart. So, here's the sort of story I want to tell. Hayek suggests that social evolution has selected for the functional desiderata in the following sense. The rules of our societies are rules that have been selected in a non-Darwinian, competitive environment as rules which allow our societies to function. And I'll try to say more about what this environment is and how the selection goes. Social evolution is largely selected for the functional desiderata. On the other hand, Hayek argues that the moral sentiments desiderata is the moral sentiments were formed under a very different evolutionary process, biological evolution. They were formed much longer ago, whereas the functional desideratum, we're going to see, is basically the last 500 years. We're talking about the moral sentiments being formed essentially between 200,000 and 40,000 years ago. So these were formed in a different environment under different pressures. And for Hayek, these two are fundamentally opposed. And that's Hayek's worry. And I'll read to you Hayek's worry. I don't want to read a lot, but I'm going to read to you Hayek's worry. The transition from the small band to the settled community and finally to the open society, he thinks the functional desideratum is selected for, and with it to civilization, was due to men learning to obey the same abstract rules instead of being guided by innate instincts to pursue common perceived goals. The innate natural longings were appropriate to the condition of life of a small band during which man had developed the neural structure which is still characteristics of Homo sapiens. These innate structures built into man's organization, in the course of perhaps this in Hayek in 79, thinking 50,000 generations, which too much was required, were adapted to a wholly different life from that which he made for himself during the last 500, or for most of us, only the last 100 generations. It would probably be more correct to equate these natural instincts, sentiments, to equate these natural instincts with animal rather than with characteristically good or human instincts. Indeed, the general use of natural as a term of praise is becoming very misleading because one of the innate functions of the rules learned later, functional, was to restrain the innate or natural instincts in the manner required to make the great society possible. So Hayek's worry, as I say, the next point in the outline which we look at is that these are evolutionary processes that operate in very different time scales. The functional is the evolutionary process which the rules of the current order of Western civilization has been formed by social evolution. These, especially in the last 1,000 years, but even more so in the last 300 years, have been selected as extraordinarily good ways for human means to cooperate in the new environment that we find ourselves in. They conflict with the moral sentiments which were the cooperative instincts formed in a different environment. And because these are two-speed processes, we are left with an understanding of the functional morality, which makes us feel the functional morality is deeply unsavory. That's Hayek's worry. Here we are, we're confronted with what works. And people say, yeah, but is that any way to live? Hayek is thinking, obviously, the socialists. Socialists are saying, but sure, the market works. But is it really a way for humans to relate to each other? Hayek says, of course you think that. That's not a wrong thought. The problem is that you're drawing on these collectivist sentiments that formed long ago in our evolutionary history. Now, interestingly, as an aside, lots of socialist philosophers have said pretty much the same thing. An important socialist philosopher of the last 20 years is G.A. Cohen. And G.A. Cohen wrote a book, What is Socialism? And socialism really is like an egalitarian, small-scale society where people help each other. And what he finds so unsavory about capitalist society is that these rules conflict with the rules that cooperative people living who care for each other would adopt. And in many ways, Cohen's just telling the opposite of Hayek's story. Which one you want to favor, whether it's the moral sentiments or the functionality, they disagree on that. But they disagree. They agree to a large extent that at least as it looks under capitalism, the functionality certainly conflicts with the moral sentiments. So here's just an easy version of the story, right, for the public lecture. You're all intellectuals, so I'll go further. The public lecture version is just two-speed processes, and if there's two-speed processes, we can see they can come out of line, out of sync. But Hayek actually tells a cooler story. Since I want to convince people that Hayek is worth reading without worrying about his politics, I want to tell about Hayek's story, which is really still, I think, one of the most sophisticated modelings of social evolution. So here's the way his modeling of social evolution goes. And I want to show that not only does Hayek think it's a problem between biological and social evolution, that's story one, the simple story, but the complicated story is Hayek thinks it's a problem within social evolution that makes for stability. So Hayek's theory of social evolution, most of the main points are still in important theories of social evolution. First of all, we start out with a series of social rules that structure interaction. These are the closest things, if you insist on making parallels to genetic evolution, these are the closest things to genes in Hayek's view. Then Hayek has a theory of complex phenomena. And the theory of complex phenomena says, out of a really complex interaction of a set of social rules, there's an emergent property. And those of you who don't know complexity theory, I won't try to explain emergent properties because not many people even in complexity theory really know what an emergent property is. They know what it isn't. But one of the things emergent properties are is they have no clear relation to the underlying properties. They're a complex property that you could not have predicted for the features of these. So if I know everything about R1, everything about R2 and 3, I could never have predicted the interaction and the feature that would arise from that interaction. I just could never have said that there would be an order of action. And that, like, order of action, Hayek means a cooperative interactive system where people cooperate. Now, Hayek has a cool theory of social evolution where there's macro selection that operates on the order in competition with other orders. And again, this is really pretty standard in contemporary social evolutionary modeling, that we can model different sorts of competitions. One is this order actively competing with another order, for example, in conflict. And early models of social evolution, going back a longer ways, see conflict as a way in which social evolution proceeds, that societies that are more successful are able to displace societies that are less successful. A perfect example of that is the Nur and the Dinka. We can talk about that, but the Nur and the Dinka are very closely related ethnic groups, but the Nur has some very small cultural changes from the Dinka, which makes them able to bring more people to the field in battles, and the Nur beat the Dinkas in almost every battle. only just be, we can almost identify the cultural variant that allows that. So one is competition, but it doesn't have to be competition by being wiped out. It could be competition through immigration. That is, other groups see this group's norms are working better, and because they see they're working better, they go to it. More importantly, it could be copying the successful. That these other groups are seeming to do so much better than we do. Maybe we should start trying to copy some of selected variants and see if we can produce that as well. So the macro selection doesn't just have one mechanism. The important thing is that whatever the competitive mechanism is, either conflict, immigration, copying, or something else, is on basically the order as a whole. Those orders that work better are copied or win. But then Hayek also suggests that, oh, this is something which he only talks about in very limited number of places, that there's also a micro-selection pressure on the rules within the group. After all, for the group to follow the rules have to work for the group. It also has to be that people in the group will obey the rules. One of the ways in which the rules can die is if they're members of a part of an emergent order, and that emergent order is eliminated in the competition between other orders. But another way a rule can die is if people in the group say, no way, I'm not going to follow that rule. And Hayek actually says one of the good things about rule violation is it tests rules to see how important they are. So Hayek not only should obey the rules, but he has a doctrine about the importance of violating rules to see whether the rules are all that necessary. Now, one of the things, to use more contemporary terms from William Richardson, is there's going to be a content bias in this selection, that some rules are learned easier and are going to be taught to their children easier. One of the things that's going to affect content biases are moral sentiments. If I'm going to teach my child a rule, it's not enough for me to think, this is the rule of our society, and our society works well. I think, is this a really unsavory rule that I don't really want my child to internalize, I don't want my child to feel guilty about? So we can expect another selection pressure on the rules from the moral sentiments, as well as other things too. Whether or not I see this rule as beneficial to me, whether or not this rule is wasteful, there's going to be a second selection pressure in this way. Now, the way that it formalized Hayek's really cool thought, which nobody's had, is that the macro is going to have very strong selection pressures on the functional desiderata, and the micro have some of the moral sentiments, perhaps enough so that rules which are really functional won't be accepted because they will seem incompatible with our moral sentiments. So one thing, for those of you who knows adaptive landscape, you can think of a functional landscape where the society is trying to get to the most functional rules, and people's moral sentiments are going to be pulling it off functional optimum because they're going to say, well, that might be better means of cooperation, but is it really just? Is it really egalitarian? And so there's a sort of a battle between the functional, which I think generally is going to win, because it's true to have a non-functional society is going to be very disadvantaged. But at the same time, this micro-selection is going to be pulling people off, pulling societies off the functional equilibrium, functional optimum to places further on down the slope. And Hayek is writing saying we shouldn't let these things have a strong effect because that's going to be in social evolution, because it's an overall consistent story. If we allow these things to have such a strong effect, we're going to end up with less functional orders, and we then could actually lose out to more functional orders that didn't have these. We could go socialist, we might end up losing out. So there's a cool theoretical story about how we can have a single account that says that these two-speed processes, and they are two speeds, this operates the moral sentiments at a much slower rate. One of the 6 gives some figures about standard notions of how many generations are required. This then can really consistently be out of sync with it. I mean, if these were operating at the same speed, you might think, well, look, if it's really dysfunctional, then people will abandon these, because after all, they're part of dysfunctional societies. But if these are really two-speed things, even if society loses functionality, people will abandon these because they were formed in a different environment. So two-speed is important, because it shows why this could be a continued source of dysfunctionality for ages. That's the whole story. Now, the cool story then depends on two things. First of all, if we accept the story, first of all, on the strength of these micro moral sentiment selection mechanisms. I mean, suppose they're there, but people don't care about egalitarianism, so they don't care about justice. Well, if that's the case, the whole story still would say, well, all of this exists, but it's such a weak force, it's going to be swamped by functionality. And I think I also think it generally is going to be swamped. One of the great mysteries is what happened to our egalitarian sentiments in the move from hunter-gatherers to agricultural societies. I mean, practically in the blink of an eye, humans went from egalitarian societies to extraordinary hierarchical societies. One of the interesting questions is what happened to moral sentiments, and a Hayekian thing would say the functionality requirement was so overwhelming that hierarchy simply ignored any egalitarian sentiments we had. But of course, the other thing that matters is the content of the sentiment. Hayek and Gaus and all traditionally political philosophers have assumed that the content of these egalitarian sentiments is very opposed to the functionality of the market order. So if either of these are not very strong, Hayek's worry is going to be mitigated, or if he's got the content wrong. That is, they're not things that are going to draw back from functionality because functionality is consistent with them. Well, if that happens, then again, Hayek's worry is going to be mitigated because we're not going to be confronted with this two-part process, one searching for functional morality and the other one pulling us back because the functional morality seems so unsavory. So what I do in this paper, and what I'll talk about for the rest of the time, is to go through, this is more prosaic because it's just going through what I think ethnography is today. And I think ethnography leads us to the conclusion that the philosophers have gotten the evolutionary facts wrong. At least the philosophers of political philosophy have. I think the philosophers in other areas are, yes, usually better. So here's the story I want to tell. And we want to know, okay, Hayek, the egalitarian sentiments, maybe they're this big problem. Let's see what they are. Where did they come from? What do we mean by them? And so here's my story about the egalitarian ethos, which, as I said, is just drawn from current ethnography. So one of the things we know, something like 40,000 years ago, culturally modern humans had arisen. It looks maybe 45, but within that, very close to that area, we've got culturally modern humans. And there's very little thing that there's major evolutionary changes in our social ways of living after 40,000 years ago. So basically, most accounts want to say that if there's a biological root to egalitarianism, it probably was pretty much there about 40,000 years ago. Here's a really cool story from Mary Steiner. Finding from Mary Steiner is actually published this at the University of Arizona. And she studied caves in Israel that had been continuously inhabited by humans for hundreds of thousands of years. So what we have is the carcasses of human kills for hundreds of thousands of years. And Steiner, her colleague, found something quite amazing. If you look at human carcasses about 400,000 years ago, they used tools, they used knives. Yet the kills are reminiscent of primate kills. Why would we infer that? Because you can see from the bones that many different implements were used, and they were cut from different directions. That's what we can infer pretty closely. That is, if we look at the bones, they were cut, the meat was cut with more than one implement, several, and they were cut from different directions. Steiner's inference is that they were cut by multiple members of the group, probably at the same time, although that's not as easy to say. What happens usually with primates is primates, the dominant, for example, the dominant chimpanzees and lieutenants might come in first, and others might come in later. By 200,000 years ago, the human carcass, the the carcasses for human kills look entirely different. There's one cut from one implement in the same direction. We don't have multiple cuts in different directions, and we have one implement. The hypothesis of Steiner is that we have what is seen in contemporary forager societies, one person distributing the kill. In societies where there is one person distributing the kill, and that's very common in forager societies, there's an egalitarian distribution of the kill. Again, the inference is we don't really know what the distribution of the kill was 400,000 years ago. What we know is that there's very strong grounds to think it was one person distributing the kill 20,000 years ago. So the hypothesis is that by 200,000 years ago, human egalitarianism, someone sharing it out equally to the group, something which no primate does. In fact, no carnivore does. All carnivores have to somehow worry about sharing meat, but they do it through dominance hierarchies. They don't through egalitarian sharing. By 200,000 years ago, it had certainly gotten going. Some notion of basic egalitarian sharing. And it's other reasons make us think that by 40,000 years ago, this was basically set. Now that's, we can know somewhat more from the archaeology, but of course it's really hard to make many inferences about life 200,000 years ago. So here's the big inferential leap. Now what I'm signaling is the big inferential leap, and if you say, I'm not happy with the inferential leap, I can understand that. And the inferential leap is this, that current, Christopher Bohm calls these LPA societies, late Pleistocene appropriate societies. That is, that these are societies, current societies, that Bohm and other ethnographers believe are indicative of general human society in the late Pleistocene era. In Bohm's survey of these LPA societies, so these are current societies that he believes are good indications of the social norms in late Pleistocene society, say 40,000 years ago, when humans culturally, or were more or less culturally developed. At 9 in the outline, I give some of his characteristics. He's found about 150 of these societies. They can't have agriculture, obviously, because agriculture comes about 10,000 years ago and major changes in human societies. He's eliminated those who trade with agricultural societies. And he's eliminated those who have any significant contact with market societies. Of the 150 societies that are left in his survey, which he's analyzed about 50 at this point in detail, so that's still ongoing, group size is 30. Now, what was the group size during the late Pleistocene era, 200 to 40,000 years ago? Very different estimates, also depending on which one, average group size, typical group size, and the estimates are anywhere from 30 to 150. And that's not just data about what the group size is, but what constitutes a group, what constitutes size. So this is certainly within what the archaeologists think that the average group size was during the low end. Most individuals in the group are not genetically related. Recent studies of genetics of foragers find a great deal of diversity within foraging groups. So whatever egalitarianism there is within foraging groups is not going to be explained by kinalterism. It's not like, well, they're very different because they're very closely related. There's not much closely related genetic material in egalitarian groups. Now, this is a big assumption. For one thing, these groups exist in our current Holocene environment, which is very different than the late Pleistocene environment. The late Pleistocene environment had all sorts of very quick changes. In fact, it was climate change. Climate change might be bad now, but it's probably the thing that invented culture. Climate changed very quickly in the late Pleistocene era. Within a few generations, the same land could go from lush to arid. So at least one of Richardson's hypotheses is that humans developed culture and these really big brains because given the really big late Pleistocene era, things were changing so quick that there actually was an advantage in having these big brains. As you know, these brains take up 18% of our calories all the time. Right? Whether you're sleeping, whether you're on Facebook in class, whether you're listening to class, it's about 18% of your calories are used just for that. So the story is to be, why do we have this tremendous calorie intake? One of the things is the late Pleistocene era required it because we had to keep on our toes. The Holocene era is very stable. lower CO2 levels. So these LPA societies exist in a different era. So that's one of the things that should make you cautious about making too many inferences. Saying that, let me make some inferences. After all, it would be sad to stop the talk now. So, what do we know about these late Pleistocene, these LPA societies? They're hunter-gatherer societies, as we call them. Well, we know, first of all, that they go for egalitarian nature. That's certainly true. It's entirely consistent with the Steiner story. As I said before, all carnivores have a problem with mitigating variations in meat. It's not like foraging. Foraging is fairly reliable. Pretty much you get the same thing foraging every day. So foraging is often just kept by the family. But hunting is a very different deal. Sometimes you come home empty, and when you do come home, you get a lot. So all carnivores have to figure some way to share the kill. Humans are the only ones who share it like equally. And these societies don't store meat. They share it out. And that's really important. Now there seems to be two core functions of this meat sharing. One is, I just mentioned, variance in reduction intake. It's a form of social insurance. If people keep their own kills, sometimes you're going to gorge yourself and have too much, and other times you're going to go very hungry. So it's a social insurance policy to ensure variation, to reduce variation. But now we come to this second one that Bohm stresses quite a bit, is the suppression of assertion of dominance. Bohm's story, which I think I'm going to try to show is supported by other ethnographers, is that one of our problems is that these primates are cooperate. And what, as you all should know, what are the big problems? Right? The big problems are alpha males. Right? You all know that from your study groups, right? Alpha males are the people who want to tell everyone else what to do. They want to take control. They want dominance. I always tell my students, you can go to study groups, but there's always going to be an alpha male there, and they're going to tell you they know everything, and they don't know diddly, but they're so sure of it, they want to be dominant, they want to convince the rest of you. And I say, you know, a study group, when you get 5 horrible answers that are exactly the same. And I said, oh, this was an alpha male behind it. In hunting, alpha males are the hunters. They bring home the stuff. They're the ones who tend to be the most risk-taking, the biggest, and most successful hunters. So here's the problem. You depend on these alpha males to hunt. On the other hand, if you allow them their way, they'll take over the group. And Bohm thinks that not only was egalitarian meat sharing a way to cut variation in intake, but it was also a way to control the alpha males. And here's what Bohm says then. It's at 11 on the handout. He says, nomadic foragers are universally and all but obsessively concerned with resisting would-be dominators and bullies. Minimally, this means that all the active hunters, generally the adult males, although interestingly in these forager societies, there's a good deal more female participation in political decisions than there was until 100 years ago. Minimally, this means that all the active hunters, generally the adult males, insist on being seen as equal, and that among themselves they tolerate no serious domination, be this in hogging vital food resources or in bossing others around. So, what Bohm's hypothesis is that one side of egalitarianism is an insurance policy, and the other side of egalitarianism is what he calls a reverse dominance hierarchy. Human society got off the ground when the rest of the group managed to constrain the alpha males. In primates, especially assuming the evidence is that we come closer to chimps, the alpha male chimps rule the groups ruthlessly. That for Bohm, the crucial move to the evolution of large-scale cooperation was to control the alpha males. And that was what he called reverse dominance hierarchy. It's not that we get along so well, we like each other. Just the opposite. Egalitarianism is a form of social technology so that we can cooperate without being dominated. And it's one which is enforced. So let me read to you from Lee's famous study of the San Bushmen. And this is an informant. It says, say that a man has been hunting. He must not come home and announce like a braggart, I have killed one in the bush. He must come first and sit down in silence until someone comes up to his fire and says, what did you see today? He replies quietly, I'm no good for hunting. I saw nothing at all, maybe just a tiny one. Then I smile to myself because I know that he has caught something big. When a young man kills much meat, he comes to think of himself as chief or a big man, and he thinks that the rest of us are his servants or his inferiors. We can't accept that. We refuse one who boasts, for someday his pride will make him kill somebody. So we always speak as if his meat is worthless. In this way, we cool his heart and make him gentle. So Boehm's take on this is that this is part of this enforced modesty is part of the reverse dominance hierarchy. Today we say we're all equal under God. Very similar. That everyone has to, in some sense, the alphas have to be controlled and have in one way or another say that they're no better than the rest of the group, perhaps worse than the rest of the group. For those of you who know Boehm's work, he's argued that there's a hierarchy of sanctions against alphas who refuse to be controlled. The first is gossip. Gossip behind his back that he thinks he's a really big guy, he's getting too big for his britches, and in small societies, gossip is a very effective tool of social control. There's ridicule, laughing at him for being such a big guy. Who do you think you are? Making jokes about him. Ostracism, sometimes the group will just pick up overnight and leave him there on his own. And last is capital punishment. I reproduced, not very easy to read, Boehm's study of capital punishment in LPA societies. Unfortunately, that's on the slide. Didn't reproduce well. So first off, capital punishment is underreported in LPA societies because central governments now don't see these as legal executions. So people are quiet about who they've executed, since it's the official government will think it's murder. On the far left side is the reason for the general category of crime. And the first is intimidation of group, which he breaks up into sorcery, repeated murder, action as a tyrant, and psychotic aggression. The second is cunning deviance, which is theft and cheating. And then social transgressions, for example, incest, adultery, premarital sex, etc. Now, interestingly, the top categories, especially the top two, sorcery and repeated murder, are by far most societies, has a number of societies reporting capital punishment for those crimes in his group of 50, which he's analyzed well now. That's the most reported source of crime. For Boehm, sorcery is seen as quintessentially an effort to control. Sorcerers make threats, and they threaten that unless you do something, then they'll hex you. So that on Boehm's analysis, and he wants to tell us that the two main causes of capital punishment are attempts at dominance. That's his data. So here's what Boehm makes of it, at 14 on the handout. These numbers do enable us to pick out one very salient pattern. Half the people killed, almost all of them males, were intimidating their groups. This was done by greedily or maliciously using supernatural powers to seriously threaten the lives of others, by being far too ready to kill repeatedly. There's a lot of one-off murders in societies. If people get angry with each other, they all have poisoned arrows. So you can expect it happens quite often, but repeated murders is a very different crime. Being far too ready to kill repeatedly out of greed or anger, by otherwise managing to seriously dominate others, or much more rarely being aggressively insane. The gender pattern is as follows. It is always a well-armed male hunter who tries to dominate his peers. When a band coalesces to bring down such a tyrant, the females may be as active as the males in the political dynamics involved. In one rare exception, when that was actively communal, they became physically involved. So the story is, Boehm's story, is that we have misunderstood egalitarianism as simply a resource sharing issue. And it is indeed a resource sharing issue. And I want to suggest that's not part of the question. But more fundamentally, the resource issue manifests a deeper concern with existing dominance. So let me just read to you a few other ethnographers and what they've concluded about egalitarianism. This is Lee, it was a famous study of Bushman that I mentioned a minute ago. It says, Lee, egalitarianism is not simply the absence of a headman and other authority figures, but a positive insistence of the essential equality of all people and refusal to bow to the authority of others. A sentiment expressed in the statement, each of us is headman over himself. Leaders do exist, but their influence is subtle and indirect. They never order or make demands of others, and their accumulation of material goods is never more, and often much less, than the average accumulation of other households in the camp. Here's Bohm himself. Such people are guided by a love of personal freedom. For that reason, they manage to make egalitarianism happen, and do so in spite of competitiveness, in spite of the human tendencies to dominance and submission that easily lead to the formation of social dominance hierarchies. People can arrest this process by reacting collectively, often preemptively, to curb individuals who show signs of wanting to dominate their fellows. Their reaction involves fear of domination, angry defiance, a collective commitment to dominate them, which is based on a fear of being individually dominated. Jens did a study of into it in the 1920s. Every man in his eyes, says Jens, is the same, has the same rights and the same privileges as every other man in the community. One may be a better hunter, another a more skillful dancer, and have greater control over the spiritual world, but this does not make him more than one member of the group, which all are theoretically free and equal. And this is lastly, a gardener who did a survey of hunter-gatherer societies. Among foragers and others who are described as pursuing individual autonomy, certain cultural features show up again and again. Pressure on children for self-reliance, independence, individual achievement, individual decisions, making matters having to do with family, power, property, ritual, extreme egalitarianism, including extreme gender egalitarianism, techniques for prestige avoidance, and social leveling in the absence of leaders. So, it's not just Bohm, although I don't want to suggest that there's no dispute on this issue, but I think ethnography is fairly clear that Hayek's concern, and also sometimes the takes of socialists, are not correct. If we read as I read this ethnography, egalitarianism is essentially rule governed. It's about the norms of our group. And it's rule governed norms which are intended to suppress bossing and suppress dominance. So, to some extent, it's about equal shares. Again, I don't want to say there's no equal shares. But even in LPA societies, rules are extraordinarily important, and it's very important that the rules are generally anti-dominance rules. That's what I think we know. We have good reasons. So let's go back to Hayek's worry to conclude. I think Hayek's worry, if we just look at the ethnographic data, is he worries too much about this conflict. And that's because the egalitarianism is a more rule-based egalitarianism. It is also a more anti-bossing rather than equal shares egalitarian than he thought. We have sort of two hypotheses that we might want to investigate as I give the final 19 on the outline. The traditional view is that humans have a taste for equal distributions. The revisionist view, which identified as humans have a tendency to adopt and enforce moral rules that resist bullying and being taken advantage of by would-be dominators. I don't think either explains the entire variance. But the question is, how much variance does each view explain? I think the revisionist view explains a lot of the variance. And then the interesting question is raised for experimentalism. And I'm not going to talk about experiments here because it's like reading Coles to Newcastle. You can talk about experiments. But the possibility, we want to look at places where egalitarian sentiments are invoked and see to what extent these egalitarian sentiments are rule-based and to what extent they're also anti-bossing sentiments. I think, for example, the Henrik and Smith's multicultural work on the Ultimatum game is a nice bit of evidence that the revisionist view may well be right. So I'll just conclude with that. One of the takes that many of the social evolutionary people have on the Henrik and Smith's finding in the Ultimatum game, I assume you know the Ultimatum game, but in case anyone doesn't, I'll explain it. In an Ultimatum game, where there's a proposer, the proposer has a certain amount of resources to be divided. The proposer can propose any division of the resources, basically, that she wants in the standard game. She proposes X, leaves the responder with the rest. If the responder accepts the offer, both parties get that split. If the responder rejects the offer, nobody gets anything. So what Henrik and Smith found was, interestingly, that the standard result in ultimatum games, which is typically that offer is below, giving the person less than 40% rare, the mode is 50-50 splits. That basic way, within some variance of playing the game, we find in every society that's acquainted with markets. In Asia, in the United States, among men, among women, very little variation. So Henrik and Smith did they played the Ultimatum game and another game with two small-scale societies, the Mapuche, which had some experience with agricultural trading, but not a lot. That is, they traded with other societies in some markets. And the Makagunge, who had very, very little markets. Now, one of the interesting things is that Makagenge, who had very little markets, played the Ultimatum game much closer to what economists originally thought people would play the Ultimatum game. Basically, people said, I'll take 9 and I'll give you 1. It's $10. These were played for 3 days' wages. So these weren't insignificant amount of money at all. Offers of this sort, that is, I take 9, you get 1. Economists kind of thought they were rational. Why? Well, because I know that your choice is between 1 or nothing. Because if you say no, you will get 0. As an economically rational agent, 1 is preferred to 0, so I know you'll take the offer, so I'll offer 9, and I'll get it. In almost all societies, if you do that, the offer is almost surely to be rejected. That is, people prefer to go away with nothing. The interesting finding is that the fair behavior, that is, people not offering less than 40 and very seldom taking less than 20, is characteristic of all peoples acquainted with markets. If you go to small-scale societies, huge amount of variation. It's not that the small-scale societies play them less equally. They play them really different in all sorts of different variables. Hypothesis about why that happens? Well, one hypothesis is that in market societies, there's strong norms about not bossing strangers, that you can't get away with too much in market societies if you try to really take advantage of people. You should have some notion of fairness towards strangers. It could well be with the Makagunge that there's just really no norm was obviously invoked, and they were relatively normless. That's some evidence, maybe, that the idea of markets and rules against bullying aren't opposed, at least not to the extent that I think they are. But they end the paper up on another note. What does seem to go down badly, perhaps, is the hierarchical corporation, or the hierarchical state. Markets are, in a sense, seas of relative equality within these islands called the firm, poke out, and they're extraordinarily hierarchical. What may really, when people find there's something about capitalism that grates them, perhaps the sentiments which are being grated against aren't about market rules, but are against capitalist firms and against government firms. Alphas love them. I have a little nasty note about deans. Deans love their sort of alphas, and they love to push people around. It well may be that when people think capitalism and egalitarianism, they haven't properly separated out the rules of the market, which may well not be things which conflict with our egalitarian sentiments, from the hierarchical organization, which still sort of fact or the market's based on, which may well be things that grate badly with us. Thank you.
You want to put the questions? Okay.
Great, thank you very much for the talk. Lots of interesting stuff. So I guess I just have 2 questions. One's pretty short. I have 2 questions. The first is relatively short. It's just about how to understand the functional desideratum. So I'm just questioning whether or not you think it isolates a particular unique social code or social morality as providing the most efficient technology for the best social cooperation, or just thinking that there could be lots of diverse social systems of rules that meet the functional considerata. And then the second is just to invite you to talk a little bit more about why the revisionist view isn't also worrisome, right? Because you had mentioned firms as being hierarchical, but it seems like there could be like larger social systems as well, where people feel like they're being taken advantage of, right? So if it seems like productivity is going up, but wages aren't going up, they might not blame the hierarchical nature of the firm, but might just see they're being taken advantage of by this system as a whole, right? And so I'm curious about that conflict, where even with the revisionist view, you might see that there's some sort of worry here, and also how to think about the functional considerata.
Great. The functional consideratum I would model as a multidimensional consideratum. So we could use sort of typical sort of modeling and think that what we mean by functionality is actually a number of different things. They have certain interdependencies between these different things, and so we could develop an adaptive landscape of functionality. And once we start being careful, we could sort of distinguish the different dimensions of functionality. So I don't want to suggest that it's a single dimension. And in fact, my little talk of pulling off of peaks down to valleys was sort of suggesting the functionality desideratum can be read as a multidimensional desideratum that gives us a coordinate landscape. I think Hayek's problem, let's go to your second question, was that Hayek, people think of Hayek as for markets, but he's really thinking the crucial point is that large-scale civilization depends on rule-based behavior. That's the, sure, markets are one of those, but what is large-scale civilization? It's rule-governed behavior. The main conflict was, are we concerned with rule-governed behavior or outcome-governed behavior? If our egalitarianism is relentlessly outcome-oriented, then we're just not going to be happy with any system of rules. So I think it's better for it, because the basic conflict between society as governed by abstract rules and society is governed by desired outcomes still suggests that our egalitarianism certainly conforms to the rule-based idea of law. But I do think you're right that when we get to highly egalitarian societies, words about dominance occur. And I don't think that the shares idea is entirely, doesn't explain a lot of variance. One of the things that I think people worry about in contemporary capitalist societies compared to the 60s is that, in fact, some people have been able to opt out so much from the common institutions that they do have a certain dominance. So we don't want to sort of go so overboard with the rules story to think, well, remember, when people have a whole lot more resources, worries about dominance occurring. I'm not saying what should be done, but I do think that we might distinguish well that people have a general preference for equality, and people that have very different reactions to equality, which they think is really putting them at severe disadvantage socially.
I mean, the way you set it up, so back in the LPA societies, there was a concern with distributions, right? And they had to be egalitarian. Hayek's concern was that spontaneous order or whatever, the functional, that there's this kind of primitive egalitarianism which conflicts with whatever this functional order is. I assume it's an economy that basically satisfies or maybe maximizes the satisfaction of people's wants and needs, something like that, right?
It's evolutionary, so it's not like there's a goal. I really don't think we should think of it as utilitarian. In some competition, that's going to be selected.
Well, but some idea of efficient, some idea of some efficient.
Yeah, it's not just the economy; it's the whole society.
Yeah. What fell out of Hayek's account, and it seems like it falls out of yours, is any concern with distribution. In other words, I mean, you just said something like, if you're concerned with outcomes, then you're going to have a difficult time being concerned with rules or satisfying rules. But I mean, you can be if you're concerned with that, egalitarian outcomes, right? Maybe. Well, what if the outcome is just an economic system that satisfies a basic minimum? I mean, that's an outcome. We want the system. It's not any particular distribution. I mean, it seems what the problem would be are particular distributions, a pattern of distributions like equal distribution. But I don't see. I mean, and that's the objection with capitalism, right? There's nothing about the way it distributes income and wealth that even approximates any kind of particular scheme of distribution. And there's no guarantee that those who are less advantaged are going to get anything, except some, subsistence wage or something. Now, I don't see why a concern with an outcome, at least to the extent of being concerned with a basic minimum, would in any way undermine this, the spontaneous order. I mean, after all, even in Hayek's case, the concern with markets is with allocation of productive resources. It wasn't distribution; it was with allocation. So there seemed to be a wide array of distributions that would guarantee that everyone's needs, their basic needs, are met, and that would satisfy his account.
Yeah. Well, let's just be a little. Now it's time to be a little more careful what we mean by outcomes and rules. Here's the basic problem. Suppose our egalitarian sentiments are only looking at outcomes of institutions. That was what the basic Hayekian word was. Then our egalitarian sentiments are always going to go against sort of rule-based behavior because they're always thinking it has to end up some way. Then we are going to be just suspicious across the board of our egalitarian sentiments. Because we're going to say, just generally, these are the things that are always encouraging us to forget about the rules and look to sort of how the society ought to look. That's the big worry. Now, we can say, yeah, but what is an outcome? Right. And I think, is an outcome having a rule that says no one starves? Well, there's a sense in which the rule says no one should starve, but starving is an outcome. So then we have this distinction between rules and outcomes. I mean, some rules might sort of specify things like states of affairs. For example, no one should kill in public. Well, that's an outcome. So what we have to ask is something like, are these the sorts of outcomes that can be accommodated within an essentially rule-based system? Because the important thing, remember, is in evolutionary views, you really don't know why these rules work so well. That's the important thing for Hayek. And that's why it's wrong to think of it as a utilitarian. It says, here's why they work. I don't know why they work. It's evolutionary. We've ended up with these rules, and they seem to be pretty functional. How do I know? Well, they beat out these other systems, right? So that's the story. They're pretty functional, but because it's complex, it's a complex phenomenon, I don't know the relations of the rules to the outcomes. So what we can do is fiddle with the rules and see whether the rules are going to produce really different outcomes. You certainly, and I think, well, in fact, he thinks that sort of minimum income rules are probably not going to fiddle too much with the overall system of rules. They probably can be fit in pretty easily. So there's, we have some question of what constitutes rules and outcomes. But what we don't do is aim at an order of actions. Because the essential part of the story is that the order of actions is an emergent property of the rules. So, look, we can fiddle with the rules, and we can't entirely predict what the order is going to be. But we can fiddle, because I said, there's the selection is the moral sentiments here. That is a selection. I didn't say we shouldn't select on the basis of the moral sentiment. I was saying the selection on the basis of the moral sentiments is not hostile to the order. But what we can't do is say, let's have a certain order, because the order is an emergent property of the rules. But selecting rules because of our moral sentiments is part of the story. So there's sometimes when Hayek seems like he's against fiddling with the rules at all, but that's because he thinks the rules are really these egalitarian rules who just want to revise the whole order. But the point of the cool version of Hayek that I think is right is that it's not never fiddle with the order. Of course, we're going to select the constituent rules about whether they agree with our moral sentiments. Hayek's worry is that they are so out of tune with the order that they're going to drive us really far off functionality. My mitigating story is I don't think they're so out of tune, so we don't have to worry about them as much. And It's not to say that we might still have all selection on the basis of these rules. But I think I believe it's wrong to see Hayek as utilitarian and think we can evaluate the order. What we can do is say, we have a reason to think orders of this sort are going to be functional.
This was just sort of a follow-up. Surely you have to have some way to evaluate the order, otherwise you can't determine whether it's well-functioning or not. In other words, what's the if 25% of the population is living in destitution, that's not a well-functioning order, is it? I think on his account, is it a well-functioning order, or what? That's the question. How do you decide that an order is well-functioning?
If it's an evolutionary account, it's because it's functioned well in competition with others, which means it survived. Look at those times in the Fatal Conceit where Hayek says this whole idea of moral justification looks a little weird. The only moral justifications we get here. The important thing, I think, is that we know where to put moral justification in an emergence account. You can't have an emergent account and say it's an emergent thing and then we're going to fix the result. What you can say is that I don't like where order is. The functionality is that the function desideratum is that this has competed against other orders. The moral comes in as inputs to the rules, saying, I don't like these rules. Maybe I don't like the fact that people are in this situation. Then I can change the constituent rules. But Hayek says, don't know you can predict the order that's going to emerge. It could be an order which is not going to work very well in the sense that other people will begin deserting the order, that you'll see immigration goes up, things like that. But we want to say we have to evaluate the order. Well, we can say I don't like our society, but I can't change our society. I can change constituent rules. But the complexity problem is I can't have a nice route between a rule change and a predicted order change. Therefore, I'm operating. Always, you're operating under what I'm asking you called available significant. I don't know what's going to happen anyway, so maybe I should change something. But we can't be social planners, even moral planners. We can react to our order, try to change the rules. Moral sentiments, moral justification comes in at this stage. But the prediction of what's going to happen. If it's a complex system, you can't. That's the whole point. Why I emphasize that people read Hayek as a utilitarian libertarian. He's a complex systems theorist. And to think that you can have a complex system theorist, right? You say, well, I don't like the result. I'm going to bring about a new complex system. Is not the way he thought societies work. But it's not quietistic, because there's no reason why we can't change the constituent rules. Hayek can say, well, if they really are things that bother you, you can change them, but you can't predict the order that's going to result from it. If they're small things, we have enough theoretical knowledge to sort of say changes that the changes tightly tied to other variables probably is going to be okay. And so he said, what is economics? He said, economics is not the prediction of outcomes. Economics is understanding the sorts of patterns the system might settle into. That's what economics is. Can't predict. Not a predictive science. But it says, well, we know some things can't happen in the system. We know some things are likely to be major disturbances, some things minor disturbances. We can know that because complex systems theory isn't all ignorance. But it's saying, I don't know where it's going to go. So like I thought, rules that prohibit allow the system to adjust in more varied ways with more degrees of freedom than rules that require. That's something that comes from his theory of the system. So when we do change the rules, we should think more about, can we prohibit or do we require? Why? Because requiring rules take away degrees of freedom from the constituents to readjust themselves. So I don't think he's a utilitarian. I don't think he's a quietist. He doesn't think the order is evolved means it's good, but he does know that an order which is going to be outcompeted can't be what we want because people will desert it. It's
so. The way you're presenting it is sort of giving a structure to Burkean conservatism. That's the
whether he's a Burkean conservative actually depends on some other issues.
Tested, like what?
Well, other issues? I think for Burke, has a theory of the complex phenomena, that these are very rugged landscapes. And so for Burke, I have this paper, sort of Burke versus Popper, and you can accept a lot, but for Burke, it's such a high-dimensional landscape that if anywhere you go, you can end up in a ravine. So you're sort of frozen. Because if it's really high-dimensional, 1 one rule variation, it can take you right to the bottom. If it's a lower dimensional landscape where the changes have significant correlation to each other, it's fairly low dimensional, then there's these nice slopes in the landscape. And if there's nice slopes, any one rule revision is going to be highly correlated with the current revision. So if it's sloping landscapes, I think social experimentation makes sense because I know whatever happens is highly correlated with the present condition. If landscapes are like this, then there's no such thing as social experimentation. It leaps into the dark. I think the difference between Hayek and Burke and Popper, and then the question is where to place Hayek. This is Popper, this is Burke, and Hayek might, how we think of Hayek, is it Burkean or experimentation, has to do with the high dimensionality of the landscape, which is produced by the interaction of these results. But you can go for the interaction and all that and the order, but if the slopes are modest enough, you don't know what's going to happen, but you know the values are highly correlated with the present values. So it's not going to go too bad. And you always can reverse because you know pretty much you're on the same slope. But if that's it, then I don't want to experiment either. Because anything could be disaster. So I think there's the complexity issue, but the other issue is just the dimensionality of the relation between these. The higher dimensional it is, the more Burke sounds right. The lower dimensional it is, the more Hayek sounds right. Or as Popper does, and then the question of using Hayek. Right?
Do you mean high dimensionality or high variance? So, this seems like a ruggedness story. If it's a dimensionality story on the landscape, then higher dimensionality can often make the problem easier, right? So like you get all these nice ridges.
Yeah,
And
but
so
that's because you have a lot of the population.
Yeah.
But no, it's high. I'm thinking high dimensional is this: an NK landscape where every K is related to every other one.
Yeah. Okay.
And that gives you what Kaufman calls a complexity catastrophe.
Yeah.
Now it's true that the way to negotiate high landscape, these dimensions, is to have a huge number of people flying out,
right,
and then see where they land, right? But if you're thinking about social experimentation, that might be different because we don't have enough members of the species to see what's going to happen. But so I'm thinking this is a high dimensional landscape, but you're right. If we have a large distribution of populations, we can see where they're landing. Right. And then if it's an evolutionary story, the guys who land here will succeed, these guys will fail.
Because that seems relevant to how we want to interpret Hayek, right? So as between Popper and Burke, insofar as Hayek is imagining multiple orders competing with each other simultaneously, right? So then the dimensionality might start looking better for us.
A lot is going to depend on how many orders there are.
Yeah.
And I think for the fitness lands ridge story, you have to have a large number of trials, right? So that's another variable.
Yeah.
If we're experimenting with our society, or if we're experimenting with lots of societies, we have a ridge story. That's exactly it.
Yeah, I have a question. Going back to Hayek's problem of how the evolved moral code that provides an efficient technology for, let's say, social order, cannot meet the moral emotion, desideratum. So it's like saying our evolved instincts are at odds with the needs of our larger society. Now, these can be interpreted in different ways. And one interpretation, which I call the non-exportability thesis, is the following. Cooperation in small groups, which has existed, forever, is supported by habits of local trust, local reciprocity, etc., etc. And we know that these local habits are difficult to export to larger society. Witness the big debate about personal and impersonal trust. Okay, we learn to trust a small group, etc. Can it be exported to a larger society where overall would be really good to have it? There would be much more, economic interaction, etc. But it's very hard. So the idea is that certain dispositions that we evolve are very local, okay, and as developed in small groups, and they are non-transferable, okay. And so there are always
Is it just because they're local, or just something else? Is it just a scaling problem?
Because
or is
it's a
else?
scaling problem.
Okay.
Huge.
Yeah.
And we know that.
I didn't mean just, I meant only.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yes.
And it's very interesting looking at the reverse phenomenon when you try to scale up certain rules or habits that have evolved in certain society, like society where there is a lot of gift giving, tend to be corrupt. Okay? So they become larger and larger, and corruption, can evolve there. So again, there is a problem of ill adaptability. The second is instead, so this is the first hypothesis, non-exportability thesis. Okay, we try to export, it's not exportable, so it's a big problem. The second is a sort of maladaptiveness thesis that it seems more similar to what you want to say. That is, we have evolved general disposition. So the egalitarian sentiment are very general, non-local dispositions. And I'm not sure I like this idea. And these very general dispositions are very sluggish, okay, in the sense that, they are like default rules that we tend to impose on social interactions that color our expectations, etc. And so we tend to export them to all sorts of domains. So from the idea is, I think what you want to say, if I understand well your paper, is that egalitarianism as a tool for social control, basically. So, is curbing the destructive urge to dominate, okay, may have evolved, but then it's like a default rule, very general, very non-specific, that then get applied to all sorts of domain that have nothing to do with it. Okay, is this sort of, if you will, maladaptiveness, sluggishness thesis, more what Hayek wants to argue for versus, the first, which is the non-exportability. You try to export, but you can't. Is a mess. Because when I read Hayek many, many years ago, he was certainly very worried about socialist societies and the socialist economic system, which completely curbs all incentives. And so you want to have incentives, you want to have efficient production, and claiming that you want to give, let's say, equal pay for different type of contribution of work, that's not a good idea because it would curb productivity and would de-incentivize people. He had all this argument, against the socialist economy, the planning, etc., etc. So, do you think that, so your argument or your defense of his question is more related to a maladaptiveness thesis? So we have about this, very generic equality, okay, equality drive or disposition, okay, to be equal, whatever it means, and then we tend to export it to all sorts of fields where it should not be exported.
Well,
so it's how the mind works, basically.
It's the should, okay? I mean, I just having trouble getting the maladaptive thesis seems like an evolutionary thesis, and the exporting seems more like a normative thesis about what works out for us. So I'm trying to sort of see whether or not they're both evolutionary thesis, the exporting thesis, or whether in some way the maladaptiveness thesis
the maladaptive
is an evolutionary version
is
of the
more
exporting
related
thesis?
to, let's say, for the sake of the argument, we have evolved this disposition, okay, to resist, all sorts of dominations, etc., etc. And so the very basic striving for equality is very much related to that. And since we are not very sophisticated human beings, this basic disposition is then, what is called, what in your paper called the moral sentiment. sense. So it's like a moral sentiment. I would call it not so much a moral emotion, but a disposition, to perceive situations one way or another. So we have this very generic disposition, okay? And then, of course, we may maladaptive in the sense that we may interpret various situations in which we have to decide, whether an exchange is equal or not, whether an outcome is equal or not, whatever, to interpret it through the lens of this disposition. And it's maladaptive because, of course, we may want very unequal outcomes if overall is better for society.
So in the end, I'm not exactly sure whether the two ways of saying very similar things, actually. So I'm still having, because with the maladaptive has to be, we have to have an understanding of adaptation. And then there's some innovation which on that understanding of adaptation sort of pulls you down from an optimum.
Yeah.
Now the thing about this story is there's two adaptations going on at the same time. And one can be male in relation to the other. And so, the social evolution is maladaptive in relation to biological evolution all the time. As Rob Boyd says, how many people here care more about the length of their CV than the size of their family? Right? This is just not good. So there we have a social norm, which is not good for biological adaptation.
Right.
So I think now you might explain the cause of the male adaptation is that in the new environment, this is being used in ways for which, but then we can sort of make sure whether that story is a real nice story for the same source of male adaptation, that is biological, right? And we want to say trait 1 emerged at a certain time, right? And now, at time T2, this trait no longer is adaptive. And then it's because whatever dispositions it has in the new environment in a way which is decreasing the survival value of that species. So it could be maladaptive in that sense that the same trait is now being triggered in a way which were in the previous environment. But then we have social too, so we have two stories. One is that one can be maladaptive in relation to the other, so it could still be biologically adaptive. But now that social evolution is going a certain way, it's socially maladaptive. So I think your story is a story about why we might think something is maladaptive. And that is that in the new environment, it no longer serves. But the thing about Hayek's story is this could be just as adaptive as it ever was here. But if this changes, then it's not adaptive in relation to that. And that's the thing about the co-evolution story, is that the adaptation now is like multidimensional because something could be maladaptive in a temporal dimension on the same criteria here and here, but then something could be maladaptive only between them in the sense that the biological is going the wrong way with the social. So both stories can be said, well, we're applying it in the wrong way, but applying it in the wrong way could be we're applying it in a way which has got the same adaptation for which it was selected, or it's interfering with this adaptation. And so from the social point of view, it's decreasing functionality, and that was my story. This trait, I wasn't considering whether this trait is biologically adaptive or all before, but this trait now in a certain social context is socially maladaptive. And that is because this trait in this new context leads us to do things which decreases social functionality.
Yeah, I am thinking of social versus social, actually.
Right.
I don't think that certain traits are really biological.
Well, that's what this whole story shows.
I think, that there are very old cultural traits that are at odds. Think of norms that survive that are absolutely inefficient, crazy, etc., and they are maladaptive.
They're socially maladaptive. Yeah,
exactly.
Sure.
So I see that within the social realm.
That's the maladaptation there too.
It's very hard for me to say that certain, traits, like what you call the moral sentiments, are really biologically determined.
I think they are.
You think?
When you had to determine, it sounded like it was a nasty thing. No, I think they.
But you think
the
there is
strong-
a genetic
The strong, I think the strong.
component.
But, you know, your story is a really interesting story, the Nur and the Dinka, which I told. But the story turned out this. Of course, the Nur and the Dinka are fighting again, as you know. But the story was this. The Nur were an offshoot of the Dinka. But they made a couple cultural innovations. And one cultural innovation is who they considered kin. For the Dinka, kin was the people who could gather together the dry season. For the Nur, kin was related to families and brothers and uncles. Well, it turns out that both groups kept the cultural norm in a battle to get your kin. But the new Nur cultural norm had twice as many people counted as kin. And the Dinka never changed. So in the whole history of the war, the Dinka won one battle. And the sad thing is that they celebrated it and then got counterattacked during the celebration. So that's a maladaptive social norm, that they have this norm of what constitutes a family. And they were unable to change this norm. It's a social norm, obviously, because the family used to be originally who you met in the dry season. Now the new social norm is by lineage, and it's a bigger one. But that's within the social sphere. The Dinka had a maladaptive social norm. Now, by maladaptive here, I don't mean it was a worse social norm. Perhaps, that was a better way to think of family. But in competition, at that point, the British government kept the Dinka from being exterminated because the Nur were pushing them to worse and worse areas because they could not change the maladaptive norm. And that's sort of quintessential cultural evolution story here. Cultural artifact. It's pretty low dimensional. We can sort of see what the result was, and they could not change their maladaptive norms. It doesn't mean that maladaptive norms will learn from them. It could well mean we won't, but then in competition they'll lose.
Yeah, the problem is that even within competition or with the threat of competition, they still keep.
Yeah.
Which is.
That's
very interesting to explain.
Yeah.
I think this is one of the
moral reasons not to change these norms. This is like, now we're getting a Hayek, there could be something else. They say, we just can't change this norm. It's too important to us. And there's no reason to think that societies will see that even if they see they have a maladaptive norm, whether they'll change it. Because it could be embedded in their value systems and all sorts of other things. So with the Nur, the Dinka would not change the norm. The Nur also had a norm that they would adopt Dinkas, and Dinkas didn't have an adoption. It allowed the Nurs to grow, right? Because one way that groups compete is through growing, and the Nur allowed adoption, and the Dinka didn't. So the Dinka couldn't get Nur, but the Nur could get Dinka. So they had two norms, both of which are maladaptive. And the Dinka never managed to change. And they're still, of course, fighting it out today in Sudan. The British just put the war off for a while.
I had a question about the moral sentiments, desideratum. And specifically, my question was about how we should reasonably cohere, and how we should read morally relevant sentiments. So I guess I'm willing to accept both the revisionist view and the traditional collectivist view, because I would assume that if we do have biologically based moral sentiments, that there's no reason that they should be coherent. But then once we get to the moral sentiments desideratum, we find out that the moral technology of cooperation should reasonably cohere with our morally relevant sentiments. Given that our sentiments are conflicting, we can't just use our sentiments as the standard for morally relevant, so we need to use some other standard. It would seem like we would need to use the functional desideratum to provide the standard for which sentiments are going to count as morally relevant.
So I agreed with almost everything you said up to that point, that there was a lot of hand-waving that needed to be filled in. It's not that last one. So relevance has to be carried out, reasonably to be carried out. All those things are just sort of placeholders for analysis. But not that the functional is going to do it. Okay, so let me talk about the one thing that I think I disagree with you about in the midst of lots of agreement. Here's the story. I'm looking at a rule. Now, I have these sentiments and I have some belief when the sentiment applies. That can change culturally, as Christine was saying. I might extend it to some new realm or retract it. But it's not the case that this retraction or expansion is going to follow functionality. It's not like I'm going to expand it because it's functional. I might have lots of reasons based on what I think is the logic of it or what feels right in this situation to sort of say, here's a situation that triggers the unfairness. And you're right, we have to say what does it mean by these situations. But it's not the functionality which is going to determine that result. So that's saying, well, if you trigger it here, that's going to make society more efficient. The story depends on us that not being the case. That whatever the trigger is for I'm going to evaluate this moral, this rule, the trigger is, for one thing, is the emergent property. I'm not even sure what functionality is. Remember, Hayek is not a predictive theorist. I don't even know what functionality is. Functionality happens. Morality is something I can control. So here's the rule, and I'm bringing this moral sentiment, and I say, is this rule, the rule that allows bankers to earn so much money, is this fair? Now, some of them say, oh, you should be thinking about bankers' salaries in terms of fairness. So we might have certainly a dispute about whether this moral sentiment is relevant. Some cultures will apply it, others won't, so there has to be some notion of triggering conditions for the moral sentiment to apply. And your entirely relevance was like a triggering condition. But what it won't be the case is the triggering condition will depend on the order and its functionality that results. For one thing, I'm not even sure what that's going to be. So there's lots of variables here. You're entirely right. What's reasonably coherent, but the story is this. We don't want a morality where people are constantly saying these rules are rules that are unfit for respect, although they work. That, yeah, I can go along with them because I guess it's okay to be a capitalist, but but capitalism stinks. For Hayek, that would be the word. That, for one thing, you have higher levels of affection, and that would relate to functionality in the end. People wouldn't teach the rules to the kids. That would have some functionality problems. But even if it was staying functional in the sense that it was not losing competitions, we would still think it's a really unpalatable morality. We'd say, is this what morality is? Okay, we're getting rich by it. But it's really very distasteful. And the reasonable cohere with, if you have this sort of view of morality, you don't want to end up with someone who says it works, but it's really unpalatable. It's basically unpalatable. But rather, sure, it has to work. And that's one of the things we want. We don't want an inefficient technology, but it has to be a technology which is palatable enough for us to go on with and teach us and believe it's actually something we should know about. Hayek's worry is that capitalism seems unpalatable because you're just not bound to like it. And this is going to always make it something. In one version of this lecture, I had Keynes's quote. Right? And Keynes says, so far it's the best we've developed, but it's many ways really nasty way to live. Right? And I think that Keynes quote is exactly what Hayek has in mind. People saying, yeah, it works, but I have to hold my nose. But then there's some sense in which it just can't be accepted as a moral system. And that's, I think, was Keynes's view. It works, but you have to hold your nose when you do it. It stinks really bad.
I'm still not sure what these moral sentiments are supposed to be. Are they sort of dispositions to accept certain types of rules? They don't seem like the moral sentiments you read in like Hume or Smith. So I'm just not quite sure what they are.
Well, you're right. That is something about Marx. I only want to say some things about it. Basically, for this paper, there are emotional reactions to inequality. That deeply seated emotional reactions. Reactions that are the form, this is unfair, this is unworthy because it's unequal. And so we want to have two notions of where these deep egalitarian-based emotions come from.
But then it seems like order could affect the triggering conditions.
I don't want to say they can't. Sure. Just give me the story. They could affect it.
Right. So you have a particular order that gets moralized, right? So now you accept the order as moral. No longer does it trigger your moral sentiment for inequality.
Well, so you're assuming there's two things: accepting it as there's a lot going on, and I don't want to suggest that you're not saying important things. The sentimentalist story that I'm sort of assuming here is that your moral judgments derive from your sentiments. Now, of course, you can have a moral judgment. This is what Hayek was trying to say: a moral judgment that you should control the sentiment and keep it at home. But there's a sort of instability about that because the story is going to be this is a powerful moral sentiment, and the system can only maintain itself if people really control it. And why do they have to control it? Because they know that if they let it out of the bag, it's going to produce a really unpleasant, dysfunctional society. Now that can happen. That's what Hayek's recommendation was. And yet there's an instability to it because it's only we're modifying triggering conditions in the belief that I should allow it to be triggered and try to control myself. But I wanted to suggest there's no reason why he has to take what looks like this very strong, I'll control my moral trigger, rather the moral trigger is not to be worried about. The sentimental trigger is not to be worried about.
Sorry, I think you misunderstood what I was talking about. So I was talking about how we tend to moralize particular rules and could possibly moralize orders, right?
Okay.
And then we have moral sentiments.
So what do you mean by moralize?
Build moral sentiments specific to that.
Okay. Oh. Is the moral sentiments doing the explaining or is anything coming out of it? That's the only thing I'm not clear about.
Right. So what I'm thinking about is think of human property, where we eventually have this system and we develop moral sentiments from a particular system that then go into it's sort of like a loop.
Right. So the point of this story is that these things are outside that loop time-wise. That is that they come, if there was a one-speed process, the loop makes a lot of sense. Because we could say, well, now that these things are within that property, we go back and change the moral sentiments, because now we get some equilibrium between them. And if they're operating essentially on the same time scale, we can give a nice loop story. But now imagine that these things are from 200,000 to 40,000, and these things are in the last 500 years. So their trigger, I thought by triggering you say we're keeping them but trying to control the situations which they interact. But the loop, the Jungian story doesn't work because the institutions are changing really quickly, but our perspective on them is really very, very stable as far as what the sentiments are.
Well, I'm questioning the veracity of that statement.
Okay, sure.
Okay.
I call it wrong.
Well, right. Simply because we have these moralized practices.
So is the veracity statement challenged because you think that these weren't formed 200,000, 40,000 years ago?
I think we have moral sentiments that are reactive, or we have moral sentiments that are reactive to social evolution.
Well, that's okay too. There can be others.
So there's just the other moral sentiments.
Okay.
There's some
They can
here.
counteract these, or do these exist?
I mean, they can exist too. I'm asking about those moral sentiments that are not those.
This story is just a simple story about how to think of the relation between two things. And there's certainly, I didn't say that these are all the moral sentiments. If you have the moral sentiments derived, these moral sentiments are relevant, not the theos.
I see. Okay.
And if you have the desideratum as if they're relevant, then Hayek tells the story that these relevant things are going to be in conflict with that. But you're right, even if they're relevant, there could be ones that evolve along with these that maybe are the ways we control them, or maybe they compensate for them, or you can tell lots of other stories about moral sentiments coming out of this, which is your story. Okay.
That's all I'm asking. Thanks.
Yeah, I'd like to try a simple story that reframes what I think you're saying, but I think in a friendly way. Switch from norms to heuristics. We have preference for egalitarian outcomes. Why do we have that? It's a really good heuristic for protecting the integrity of the dam and buffering the shocks from the environment with small numbers. And so it's a smart thing to have built into us. Can we get around? So it's supposed to even pretty hardwired. Can we get around it and learn it? Yeah, there's two good examples, at least. One is the Army. If we think it's in our interest, we'll submit to bullying. That's the Army. And the other example is that our social life may be organized this way as well. That's called the myth of the invisible hand. It's the story about why bullying is okay. It's actually good for you. And what Hayek is worried about, not conjecture, I'm asking someone, that it's so ingrained that it's hard for us to accept what is actually in our interest. This is some sort of invisible hand story.
Well, Hayek. I don't know what invisible hand stories
So
are. This is what Hayek's not.
but anyway, the argument is
Go ahead.
that you might be able to tell a story based upon heuristics driven by evolution or rational or prudence, basically.
And I think you could tell the story both ways. I think it'd be a really nice way. But it's going to matter which of two stories we tell. This is a heuristic that was basically for the band, was the way you described it. It helped the band in the previous times, and it may be inappropriate. Maybe there's going to be lots of strategies to figure out ways not to invoke it, that to show people it's overridden or something else. The other story is, you know what? This is a heuristic to stop people from pushing you around. Therefore, it's a resource, not something to be controlled. That is, whereas the debate has been framed as how are we going to not invoke this in contemporary societies because it's something which is atavistic. Rather, the heuristic on this story is something which is freely invoked and upon which market societies depend.
Yeah, just a slight limitation. The heuristic could be aimed at not being bullied around because that's actually prudence, because it's not in your interest in these conditions, right? Because you get an environmental shock, there's not enough food around, the bullies get to eat the band, and you don't, and then the band actually, falls apart. It may be something like that.
Right, then we have to sort of model whether or not this is sort of individually fitness enhancing or not individually fitness enhancing. It's a multi-task story, something like that. There's all sorts of ways you can fill the story out. So people are all right, so we could ask all these different questions. But here's the question: if you accept, as Christina doesn't and I do, that there's very basic understanding of how we relate to each other, which really are pretty hardwired. That's what humans are about. Here's a question which is word theorist. Is the modern society we live in something which the strategy is to control them? If we have to have an army, then it's fine, but basically, we want to control these instincts as far as possible, and that's what modern society depends on. Or have we had an over-romanticized notion of where they came from, and this over-romanticized notion of where they came from actually backs us into misunderstanding their role in current society, which makes us, I think, try to reevaluate what it means, the relation of egalitarianism and large social orders. There's a whole debate in political philosophy about the conflict between liberty and equality. It's based often on a very primitive notion of equality, aka Cohen and Hayek's. And there's a whole debate in political philosophy about this, whereas we understand what I think a better understanding of what we think about egalitarian orders, much of the debate has been misframed. And we've missed the target of the debate. And there's the conflicts that people thought political philosophy depends on, turns out not to be the conflict at all.
Yeah, so am I correctly interpreting the last statement? I mean, it seems like by the time where I reached your revisionary view, it seemed actually quite in line with typical tendencies amongst egalitarian political philosophers today. You think, well, it's not, I mean, there sure are somewhat egalitarians, right? But the trajectory of egalitarian philosophy since Rousseau has not just been about equal distribution, but about being treated fairly, right? Being not taken advantage of. And so I thought that the place where you ended up was actually quite close to that, but your last remark seems to suggest, well, in fact, if the right way to interpret the egalitarian tradition of political philosophy is as being concerned strictly with equal distribution.
Well, I mean, there's a sense in which Liz Anderson has tried to reevaluate what egalitarian is. They can sort of see it as a move both ways. I mean, Liz likes this story. But Liz likes this story because she's been working on getting egalitarians not to think about it in that same sort of way. So, I mean, one way to think, this is moving Hayekians towards equality, and Liz's work has moved egalitarians more towards rule-based behavior. And there's still an interesting distinction, though, in this group. And Josh Cohn has raised it to me. He says, do you want to really be a Rawlsian or do you want to be an Elizabeth Anderson person? Or, and I say, a Republican, right? Because here's the interesting question. Whether or not the non-domination is a face-to-face non-domination, or whether or not it's basically that we have to be able to reflectively say these rules don't bully or take advantage of people. So there's still two ways you might go in all this. First, I think egalitarianism is like Liz and others, I think those are the people that are the main targets. But then we have sort of the Republican view and the Rawlsian view. We ask, is this a way in which we evaluate institutions, or is this the way we look each other in the eye? And there's still an interesting question about whether or not there's two interpretations of this. I was thinking it's more of the Rawlsian interpretation, that we have to we evaluate our basic rules as those which we see satisfy our understanding of not being bullied. But the other way to take it is that we want rules that when I look at you in the face, you're not bullying me. And there's a sense in which the Republican is closer to the original story, right? I don't like that. So, there's an interesting way about whether or not this leads you to a particular Republican understanding, which I would hope not, or whether or not it's a way of sort of thinking that sort of basic understanding of basic structures can be evaluated in terms of non-domination, whether we can step back from the intimate social relations that much. And that I don't know about. I do think you're right, but I think there's just been, partially it's because Liz has done a lot of hard work to try to get egalitarians off of the story, which is the GA compact story, which I think is the traditional story.
Any more questions? Okay, we thank you very much. Totally against it.
What's that? No.
What do you think?
Well, okay.
I think it's very interesting. It seems to equate this drive to equality with